What if your family's greatness was built on stolen genius, and exposing it meant destroying everything you've ever known? Thomas Priore moved through the cavernous corridors of the university archives, the scent of aged parchment and dust curling around him like a tangible presence. Each step echoed softly against stone floors, a reminder that these halls were not often tread, that the knowledge within these walls had been hidden from the eyes of the world. He clutched the permission papers tightly, a small reassurance against the thrill and apprehension coiling in his chest. Today, he was not merely a professor. He was an intruder into a sanctum of secrets, a witness to history that had been carefully curated and concealed for generations. He stopped before a portrait of his great-grandfather, the man whose bronze bust sat in the main plaza. Up close, the oil paint was cracking, the eyes a dull, predatory gray. Thomas felt the weight of the silver signet ring on his finger, a Priore family heirloom. It felt like a shackle. For 30 years, he had been told that his lineage was the bedrock of this city's enlightenment. But as he looked at the cold, painted sneer of his ancestor, he felt a wave of nausea. He wasn't here to honor the man. He was here to exhume him. He adjusted his spectacles, his heart thudding against his ribs like a trapped bird, and forced his feet to move toward the heavy oak doors. Every second of silence in the hallway felt like a witness, recording his betrayal. He paused at the entrance to the main chamber, the doors massive, carved oak with iron hinges that groaned as he pushed them open. A soft golden light spilled into the otherwise dim corridor, revealing a woman bent over a delicate collection of letters and manuscripts. Sloane, the university's restorer, worked with quiet precision, her hands moving as if she were conducting a ritual. Every fold, every tiny crease, every faded stroke of ink mattered. Thomas froze for a fraction of a second, noting the intensity in her gaze, the way she treated the fragile documents as living entities rather than inanimate objects. Their eyes met, and an almost imperceptible spark passed between them. Curiosity, recognition, and a shared reverence for the fragile truths they both sought to preserve. Thomas cleared his throat, attempting a polite introduction, but found his words tangled in awe. I have permission to access these archives," he said, voice echoing slightly in the high-ceilinged room. Sloane looked up, her expression guarded but not unfriendly. "I know," she replied, her tone calm, measured, almost as if she had anticipated his arrival. "I've been expecting someone. Not that I knew who exactly." Her eyes flicked to the stack of papers between them, then back to him, assessing. He noticed the faint traces of ink on her fingertips, the meticulous way she had organized the letters by date, author, and material condition. It was an order that reflected both intellect and devotion. "You're a Priore," Sloane said, her voice cutting through the dust like a blade. She didn't look up, her focus still on a microscopic tear in a 17th-century map. "The last time a Priore came down here, he didn't bring permission papers. He brought a padlock and a list of things he wanted misplaced." Thomas stiffened. "I'm not my father, Miss Sloane." Thomas stiffened. "I'm not my father, Miss Sloane." Even as he said it, the ghost of Arthur's voice echoed in his mind, a cold phantom reminding him that a Priore's first duty was to the facade, never to the foundation. He felt the silver signet ring grow heavy, a leaden weight against his skin. "That remains to be seen." She finally straightened, her spine popping in the silence. She looked at him with eyes that had spent too much time in the dark, wide, perceptive, and utterly devoid of the academic sycophancy he was used to. "The dean thinks you're here to find more glory for the family museum. He thinks you're going to find a way to make the founder look even more like a saint." "And what do you think?" Thomas asked, stepping into the amber circle of her lamp. Sloane tilted her head, studied the ink stains on his cuffs. "I think you look like a man who just realized his house is built on a graveyard, and you've finally found a shovel." She slid a heavy, iron-bound ledger toward him. "Don't say I didn't warn you. Once you see it, you can't unsee it." The silence in the archives was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic, clinical rasp of Sloane's scalpel and the scratch of Thomas's pen. They worked in a pool of amber light that felt like a fragile bubble against the encroaching shadows of the shelves. Sloane worked with a focused, surgical intensity, her scalpel peeling back layers of grime with a precision that bordered on the obsessive. She didn't just clean the documents. She interrogated them. "Look at the ink composition here," she murmured, beckoning him closer. As Thomas leaned in, the scent of lavender and sharp chemical fixatives filled his senses, a strange, sterile perfume of the past. Their shoulders brushed, a brief, accidental contact that sent a jolt of static through the dry air. The iron gall ink in this ledger doesn't match the official charters, she explained, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. The acidity levels are wrong for the date. It means the original founders' records were backdated. Someone spent months in 1812 trying to rewrite what happened in 1790. Thomas watched her hands, ink-stained, steady, and infinitely careful. He realized then that they were engaged in a form of forensic exhumation. While the university slept above them, they were down here in the dark, performing an autopsy on a lie. The silence of the archives was no longer empty. It was thick with the weight of their shared discovery, a burgeoning intimacy built not on words, but on the terrifying gravity of what they were uncovering. Every time their eyes met over a decoded passage, the professional distance between them eroded further, replaced by a silent, desperate pact. His fingers brushed a texture that felt wrong. Thinner, more brittle than the surrounding parchment, tucked into the spine of a leather journal. He extracted it with trembling tweezers. As the sheet flattened, the ornate, shaky script seemed to pulse under his gaze. The ink was a dark, bruised purple, the handwriting frantic, as if the writer feared the paper would be snatched away before the final sentence. Thomas felt a drop of cold sweat slide down his temple. His eyes skipped over the formal headers and landed on a name, Elias Thorne, a man history had forgotten. The letter wasn't a request for funding. It was a desperate plea for recognition. They have taken the blueprints for the steam engine and called them their own. I am to be silenced, paid in crumbs to watch my life's work bear another man's name. The signature at the bottom was a jagged scrawl, the ink blotched where a hand had trembled. It was the handwriting of a man who knew he was already a ghost. Sloane, he whispered, the sound cracking the stillness. Look at the dates. And the signatures. She leaned in, the faint scent of lavender and chemical fixatives following her. Together, they read the confession of a man who hadn't built a legacy, but had stolen one. The letter detailed a systematic campaign of intellectual theft and the silencing of original inventors. The noble founder wasn't a visionary. He was a scavenger. In that moment, the grand marble statues of the campus outside felt less like tributes and more like gravestones for the truth. The archives ceased to be a room and became a closed system, an island of cold light in an ocean of institutional silence. Outside, the university followed its rigid schedules, but inside, time dissolved. The pursuit of evidence superseded everything: status, fatigue, even the fear of discovery. They existed in an echo chamber, where every discovery amplified the growing bond between them. Over cups of tea that went cold while they debated the provenance of a signature, a professional alliance shifted into something more dangerous, a pact. Sloane would look up from a document, her eyes bright with the fever of the hunt, and find Thomas already watching her, a shared thought passing between them before a single word was spoken. They began to move in a subconscious rhythm, passing pens and magnifying glasses without looking, their hands occasionally brushing over the brittle paper. Those brief contacts were electric, grounded in the terrifying realization that they were now the only two people in the world who knew the truth. They were no longer just scholars. They were custodians of a volatile secret that, once released, would force a violent collision with the very power structures they had spent their lives serving. The gravity of the discovery acted like a physical weight, pressing them deeper into their chairs as the clock on the far wall ticked toward 3 a.m. Sleep was a luxury they could no longer afford. Thomas and Sloane moved with a desperate, systematic energy, cross-referencing the founders' bold claims in the official history against the jagged, panicked numbers in the hidden ledgers. Each entry was a nail in the coffin of the university's reputation. They found redirection of royalties, forged patents, and letters of intimidation that effectively dismantled the institution's foundational myth piece by piece. "It's all here," Sloane murmured, her voice thick with exhaustion and awe. "Every lie they taught us, documented in his own hand." They worked shoulder to shoulder, their shadows stretching long and thin across the stone floor. As they cataloged each inconsistency, The shared dread of what this would do to their careers was eclipsed by a quiet, fierce thrill. They were on the precipice of stripping away the layers of a sanitized past to reveal the raw, ugly truth beneath. In the stillness of the night, every shared glance over a shocking revelation became a tether. Their dependence was no longer just about the research, it was an emotional gravity. They were becoming the only two people who could understand the weight they were now carrying, their fingers occasionally lingering a second too long as they exchanged folders, a silent acknowledgement that they were now irrevocably bound by what they had found. As dawn's light filtered weakly through the tall windows, Thomas and Sloane finally stepped back. Exhausted, yet exhilarated, they realized their relationship had shifted. They were no longer simply allies in research. They were co-guardians of truth, each aware that the path ahead would test not only their intellect, but their loyalty, morality, and the fragile trust that had begun to form. The archives had become their sanctuary, their crucible, and their cage. Outside, the world awaited, unaware of the storm quietly building in the shadows of history. The following week brought a subtle shift. Thomas arrived at the archives to find Sloane already absorbed in her work, light from the tall windows casting a soft glow over her careful hands. The rhythm of their research continued, but an unspoken tension lingered in the air. Thomas felt it first. A glance down the hallway, the faint click of polished shoes against stone floors. Someone was observing. It was Dean Arthur Priore, Thomas's father. His presence was never overtly hostile, never a raised voice, yet every step, every measured glance carried authority. Thomas stiffened, awareness sharpening. Sloane noticed his momentary hesitation. "Is everything okay?" she asked softly, not looking up from her delicate tracing of faded ink. He forced a small smile. "Yes, just my father. He's walking through the archives today." She paused, then nodded, understanding that the man represented far more than familial authority. He embodied the institution itself. Arthur moved between the stacks, his eyes flicking to documents, to researchers, to his son. He spoke with mild warmth, a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Thomas, I trust you are making good use of the archives," he said. The words were innocuous, polite, yet weighted with expectation. Thomas nodded. "Yes, father. The collection is remarkable." Arthur's gaze lingered, assessing, and he offered no further comment. Thomas felt the sweat prickle at his hairline, his pulse a frantic hammer against the silence of the vault as he realized his father wasn't just visiting. He was marking his territory. The air between them crackled with an unspoken ultimatum. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Every choice Thomas made would now be measured against his father's judgment and the prestige of the university. Instead of his usual calculated distance, Arthur stepped into the intimate radius of the desk, the heavy scent of his sandalwood cologne suffocating the smell of the parchment. He didn't look at the documents. He looked at the way Thomas's hand hovered protectively over the folder. "The Board of Trustees is not just an assembly of scholars, Thomas," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a register that made the floorboards seem to vibrate. "It is a cartel of expectations. They are funding a legacy, not a postmortem. If you stumble upon a clerical inconsistency from a century ago, remember that a Priore's duty is to the structural integrity of the house, not the dust beneath it." He picked up Sloane's scalpel, testing its edge with a thumb. "Precision is a double-edged gift, Miss Sloane. Used correctly, it restores. Used recklessly, it severs. I trust you both know which end of the blade you are holding. We are announcing the expansion next week. Ensure the narrative remains as polished as the marble it will be carved into." After Arthur left, the atmosphere in the archives shifted. Sloane whispered, "He watches closely. Be careful." Thomas's stomach tightened. The pursuit of truth had become dangerous, not in the abstract, but in direct, immediate terms. They returned to the controversial letter, carefully examining the next set of documents that might corroborate or refute its claims. Every scratch of pen, every turn of fragile pages, carried the weight of secrecy. Mistakes could have consequences. The stakes were no longer academic. They were personal. That night, Thomas and Sloane worked later than usual, the room dim except for the warm pools of light over their workspace. A shared silence stretched, filled only by the faint sounds of careful handling and the distant hum of the building. Thomas spoke finally, quietly, almost to himself. I can't let him know what we've found. Not yet. Not until we understand the full scope. Sloane nodded, understanding perfectly the unspoken complexities. The man they faced could destroy careers, futures, even the lives of those Thomas cared for. She adjusted the fragile stack of papers. Then we proceed carefully. No one can see, no one can know. Only us. As hours passed, their connection deepened. It was no longer only intellectual curiosity binding them. It was shared risk, trust forged in secrecy, and subtle, unspoken attraction. Small gestures, the passing of a pen, a shared glance over a line of text, an almost imperceptible touch on a fragile page, threaded intimacy through the long night. Each moment built upon the last, a slow accumulation of understanding, camaraderie, and a recognition that they relied upon each other more than either would admit. Yet outside the protective walls of the archive, Dean Arthur Priore was already strategizing. He had noticed his son's increasing obsession with the documents, the hours spent with Sloane, the subtle signs of secrecy. To him, the preservation of the university's prestige mattered above all else. His approach would not be confrontational at first. It would be subtle, manipulative, bureaucratic. A well-timed dinner invitation, a casual remark about Thomas's future position, the implicit reminder that loyalty to the institution was expected. Each maneuver was designed to create unease, to test compliance, without overt confrontation. By the early hours of morning, Thomas and Sloane cataloged their findings and carefully stored the letter, hidden among other innocuous documents. Both were aware of the growing shadow over their work, the unseen observer, the looming institutional pressure. Their echo chamber remained intact within the archive walls, but beyond them, the real world, hierarchy, family, power, waited to intervene. They left the archives together, walking silently through the deserted hallways, understanding that the night's discoveries were only the beginning. The stakes had risen. The game had changed. The very air in the university felt weaponized, the silence in the hallways no longer respectful, but predatory, as if the stones themselves were reporting back to the dean's office. The atmosphere shifted from academic sanctuary to a site of active surveillance. While Dean Arthur Priore had not yet moved openly against his son, the administrative pressure on Sloane intensified through a series of formal warnings regarding procedural infractions. The internal audit office was a tomb of glass and brushed steel, designed to make anyone inside feel microscopic. Sloane sat before the three men, her hands folded precisely on her lap to hide the tremors. The lead auditor, a man named Holloway whose soul seemed to have been replaced by a spreadsheet, leaned forward. "We've reviewed your requisition of high-spectrum UV scanners, Miss Sloane. Equipment reserved for high-security restoration, not casual academic assistance for the dean's son. Professor Priore's research requires forensic-level clarity," she replied, her voice a flat, rehearsed monotone. "The university's resources are for the university's projects," Holloway countered, sliding a document across the desk. "This is a formal notice of suspension. Your security clearance is being reevaluated. We've also taken the liberty of freezing your access to the digital catalog." He paused, his eyes narrowing behind rimless spectacles. "It's a long fall from the restricted wing to a career in a basement museum, Miss Sloane. If there's something the professor has asked you to hide, something that might be damaging, now is the time to leverage that for your own survival." Sloane looked at the document, then back at the man. She realized then that they weren't just protecting the past, they were terrified of it. "I'm a restorer," she said, standing up. "My job is to fix what's broken. Sometimes, that means removing the layers of varnish that shouldn't be there. You can take my clearance, but you can't make me unsee the rot under the paint." She walked out, her heart hammering against her ribs, knowing she had less than 24 hours before the locks were changed for good. They were no longer just researchers. They were targets operating within the enemy's perimeter. Sloane's hand tightened on the strap of her bag as they retreated into the deeper shadows of the stacks. "We don't have until tomorrow, Thomas. Holloway didn't just suspend me. He signaled the vultures. The locks will be cycled by dawn." Thomas looked at the sprawling mess of evidence on the table, the Thorne letter, the modern ledgers, the proof of Julian's leveraged care. The time for academic caution had expired. "Then we don't leave," he said, his voice dropping to a low, jagged edge. We finish the scan tonight. We bypass the internal server and go straight to an external uplink. If we're going to burn this house down, we do it before they can board up the windows. The battle had begun, and it was not only historical truth at stake, but their freedom, their professional integrity, and the fragile trust growing between them. Outside, the university seemed calm, innocent, and unaware. Inside, the fight for truth, and for each other, had already escalated. Before facing his father, Thomas drove to the outskirts of the city, to the quiet, red-brick facility where Julian lived. The St. Jude's Recovery Center was expensive, a cost covered entirely by the university's legacy fund. It was a golden cage, and they both knew it. Julian was in the garden, staring at a chessboard as if the wooden pieces held the secrets of the universe. He looked frail, his eyes reflecting the foggy haze of the medication that kept his episodes at bay. "Thomas," Julian said, his voice thin but warm. "You look like you're carrying the weight of the library on your back today." Thomas sat across from him, the iron chair cold against his back, watching Julian's eyes track a bird that wasn't there. The guilt was a physical weight, a heavy stone in the pit of his stomach. If he burned the house down, the university's legacy fund, the very source of the intravenous cash flow keeping Julian in this manicured purgatory, would dry up within hours. His brother would be discarded, moved to a state-run facility where the walls were stained with tobacco and the staff had forgotten how to speak in anything but barked commands. It wouldn't just be a relocation. For someone as fragile as Julian, it would be a slow, bureaucratic execution. "I've spent 10 years convincing myself that this was the only way to save you," Thomas whispered, reaching out to touch the chessboard. Julian's hand shot out, surprisingly fast, pinning Thomas's wrist to the table. His grip was like a bird's claw, sharp and desperate. "You've spent 10 years paying for my silence with my own soul," Julian hissed, his eyes suddenly burning with a clarity that was more terrifying than his usual haze. "You think these gardens are for me? They're for the Priore name. So the neighbors can say, 'Look how well Arthur treats his broken boy.' I am a museum exhibit of Father's mercy, Thomas. I am the tax deduction for his conscience." Julian shoved Thomas's hand away, knocking a bishop to the grass. "Our Father treats the truth like a tool, a hammer to shape the world. But a foundation built on a hammer will eventually shatter. Don't let me be the mortar that holds his lies together for another decade." Julian reached for a knight, his fingers, thin and almost translucent, trembling slightly as they hovered over the board. "You're afraid that if you release this truth, the walls of this place will collapse on me," he said, his voice devoid of his usual fog. "But look around, Thomas. These walls collapsed a long time ago. Our Father doesn't pay for my peace. He pays for my absence. I am the smudge on the Priore portrait that needs to be kept in a darkened room." Thomas felt a cold ache in his chest. He remembered their childhood, how Julian had always been too sensitive for the Priore name, how Arthur would lock him in the study for hours for a single mistake in a Latin recitation. "He said he'd move you to a state ward, Jules. You know what those places are like. No gardens, no quiet, just white noise and concrete." Julian finally looked up, his eyes piercingly clear. "Then let it be concrete. I'd rather rot in a state cell knowing that for once in your life, you didn't flinch when he looked at you. You've spent your whole life being his shadow, Thomas. It's time to step into the light, even if it burns." He tipped his king over with a definitive click. "Go. And don't come back here seeking permission to be brave. I won't be your excuse for cowardice anymore." The confrontation at Dean Arthur's residence felt less like a family dinner and more like a court-martial. The air in the study was thick with the scent of expensive brandy and old leather. Arthur stood by the fireplace, his silhouette imposing against the flames. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Destroy the letter, Thomas," his father said, the words falling like stones into a deep well. "Burn it, and your brother's medical leave remains a private matter. His position, his future, it all stays secure. But if you persist with this crusade for transparency, you both lose everything. I will strip you of your tenure and him of his dignity before the sun sets." Arthur walked slowly toward the sideboard and poured himself a double cognac. The crystal decanter clinked against the glass, the only sign of his agitation. "Do you honestly believe you're the first one to find that letter, Thomas?" His voice was as smooth as silk, but underneath lay the jagged edge of a threat. I found it 30 years ago. My father found it before me. We didn't bury it because we were ashamed. We buried it because we understood the responsibility of power. A university isn't built on truth. It's built on the idea of truth. If the world knew the foundation was rotten, the whole structure would tilt. Millions in grants, thousands of students, the very stability of our family name, all gone for a single piece of vellum. He turned, the firelight catching the amber liquid in his glass. You think you're being a hero. You're just being a vandal. You want to spray paint Liar on a cathedral and call it progress. He stepped into Thomas's personal space, the smell of expensive tobacco and old power radiating from him. I am giving you a choice between a dead inventor and your living brother. Choose carefully, son. Integrity is a cold bed to sleep in when you have nothing else left. Thomas stood in the center of the archive, the flickering overhead lights casting long, jagged shadows across the rows of silent witnesses. The air felt heavy, as if the thousands of books were leaning in to hear his surrender. He gave me the choice, Sloane, he said, his voice a hollow rattle. The letter for Julian's life. If I publish, they don't just stop the funding. They'll move him to a facility that specializes in permanent containment. It's a dungeon with a medical license. Sloane didn't offer a platitude. She walked to the central table and slammed a heavy, leather-bound volume onto the wood. Then your father is more desperate than we thought. You don't threaten to kill a hostage unless the ransom is everything. She grabbed his hand, her grip surprisingly strong, forcing him to look at the documents they had spent weeks uncovering. We have the theft of the invention, yes. But look at these ledgers from the 1950s. Look at the signatures on the redirection of the state grants. It's not just the founder, Thomas. It's a continuous, multi-generational crime. Your father didn't just inherit a lie. He's been actively managing the interest on it for decades. She leaned in, her eyes burning with a cold, strategic fire. We don't just release the Thorne letter. We link it to the modern accounts. We find the paper trail of how he's been laundering Julian's care through the university's charity endowment. We make it so that if he touches Julian, he triggers an audit that will bury the board in a federal investigation. We don't just burn the house. We build a cage around the arsonist. Outside, the world was unaware, yet inside, the echoes of betrayal and loyalty intertwined, foreshadowing the perilous choices still to come. The infiltration began at midnight. The archives transformed into a battlefield of shadows and silicon. While Thomas worked with feverish precision to capture ultra-high-resolution scans of the physical evidence, Sloane sat hunched over a laptop, her face illuminated by the cold blue light of the monitor. She was monitoring the uplink to an external secure server located halfway across the globe. The air was thick with the hum of the cooling fans and the heavy, rhythmic thud of their own hearts. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by the heavy, mechanical click of the archive door's electronic lock. They bypassed the external hub, Sloane hissed, her eyes darting to the secondary monitor. They're not waiting for morning. They're coming to sanitize the room. Thomas looked at the door. He could hear the heavy, rhythmic thud of combat boots, not campus security, but the private contractors Arthur kept on the payroll for discreet matters. He grabbed a heavy brass bookend from the table, his knuckles white. How much longer, Sloane? The encryption is bottlenecking. 2 minutes. Maybe 3. The handle rattled. Then, a sharp, metallic crack as a crowbar met the frame. Thomas stood in front of the desk, shielding the laptop with his body. He felt a strange, detached calm. For 30 years he had feared this man, this institution, this shadow. Now, as the wood splintered and the first beam of a tactical flashlight cut through the dark, he realized the shadow only had power if you refused to look at it. Get back, Sloane, he whispered. Don't stop the upload. No matter what. The progress bar flickered at 99%, an agonizing sliver of white in a sea of blue. Outside the door, the screech of metal against wood reached a crescendo. With a final, violent heave, the oak frame splintered, and the heavy door slammed against the interior stone wall. Step away from the terminal. A voice barked, eclipsed by the blinding glare of tactical lights. Sloane didn't look up. Her face was a mask of cold fury, her eyes reflecting the scrolling lines of code. The lead contractor reached for her shoulder, his hand outstretched to rip her away, but Thomas stepped between them. He didn't use the brass bookend as a weapon. He used his body as a barricade, anchoring his feet against the desk. "Touch her, and you'll have to explain to the dean why his son is in the hospital," Thomas said, his voice terrifyingly steady. The hesitation lasted only a second, but it was the second they needed. A sharp, melodic chime echoed from the laptop speakers, a sound of digital triumph. Sloane slammed the laptop shut with a definitive crack. "It's gone," she whispered, a jagged smile breaking across her face as the guards swarmed them. "You're chasing ghosts now. It's on every server from here to Geneva. Kill us, and you just prove the data is real." In the doorway, the silhouette of Arthur Priore appeared, his face pale and distorted in the shadows. He didn't bark orders. He simply watched as the empire he had spent 30 years guarding evaporated into a cloud of encrypted packets. By morning, the administrative offices were in a state of controlled panic. The digital breach was irreversible. The documents were already being analyzed by global academic forums and news outlets. The digital fallout was not a wave. It was a tsunami that leveled the university's ivory towers in hours. By noon, the Thorne revelation was the lead story on every major news aggregate, but it was the supplemental data, the Priore protocols, that caused the real devastation. It wasn't just the century-old theft of a steam engine. It was the documented, cold-blooded suppression of modern dissent, the list of names, dates, and bank accounts used to buy the silence of anyone who had ever questioned the university's unbroken line of integrity. The board of trustees, men who had toasted Arthur's health for decades, moved with the vicious speed of sharks smelling blood. They didn't issue a statement of regret. They issued a purge. By 2 p.m., the university's legal department had filed for an injunction against Arthur Priore himself, attempting to distance the institution from the man they had empowered. The endowment funds didn't just decline. They vanished, as philanthropic foundations pulled their names from buildings to avoid being splattered by the mounting scandal. Arthur's office, once a fortress of mahogany and quiet power, became a glass cage. Faculty members who had bowed to him in the morning now walked past his door with their heads turned, as if his disgrace were contagious. The university's stock in intellectual prestige had crashed to zero, leaving behind only the raw, ugly numbers of a criminal enterprise. Thomas pushed open the double doors of the dean's office without knocking. The room was stripped bare. The heavy oil paintings of ancestors had been crated, leaving pale, ghostly rectangles on the wood-paneled walls. Arthur stood by the window, his silhouette no longer imposing, but shrunk, his shoulders stooped under the weight of a suit that suddenly seemed too large for him. The air was thick with the smell of scorched paper. Arthur had been burning personal files in the grate until the smoke detectors forced him to stop. "You didn't just expose a secret, Thomas," Arthur said, his back still turned. "You dismantled a heritage. You've ensured that the name Priore will be a footnote in a scandal rather than a chapter in history." "I didn't dismantle it, Father. I just stopped pretending it was made of gold when it was actually made of lead," Thomas replied. He walked to the desk and laid out a single, heavy sheet of paper. It wasn't a confession or a plea. It was a binding legal transfer of Julian's guardianship and a guaranteed trust fund, carved out of Arthur's personal offshore accounts, accounts the public didn't know about yet. But what if Thomas pressed a single button? Arthur turned, his eyes bloodshot, looking at his son as if he were a complete stranger. He picked up the pen, his hand shaking so violently that the nib scratched the expensive vellum. He signed it, not with the flourish of a dean, but with the desperate, jagged stroke of a man buying his way out of a burning building. He slid the paper back across the desk. "Get him out of here. Get both of yourselves out of my sight. You wanted the truth, Thomas. Now you have it. Let's see how long you survive without the shelter of the lies I built for you." Arthur turned, his eyes bloodshot, looking at his son as if he were a complete stranger. He picked up the pen, his hand shaking so violently that the nib scratched the expensive vellum. He signed it, not with the flourish of a dean, but with the desperate, jagged stroke of a man buying his way out of a burning building. He slid the paper back across the desk. "Get him out of here. Get both of yourselves out of my sight. You wanted the truth, Thomas. Now you have it. Let's see how long you survive in the ruins of the world I built for you." Thomas picked up the signed document, the ink still wet. He didn't feel the sting of his father's words. He felt only the physical weight of Julian's freedom in his hands, a weight far heavier and far more precious than any tenure or title he had lost. He walked out of the office, past the empty crates and the smell of scorched legacy, without looking back. The fallout was clinical, swift, and absolute. Within 48 hours, the university's board of trustees, faced with an international outcry and plummeting endowments, moved to cauterize the wound. Arthur Priore's resignation was announced as a retirement for health reasons, though the empty boxes being carried out of his office told a different story. For Thomas, the victory came not with the headlines, but with a signed legal document, a transfer of guardianship that ensured Julian would never again be used as a pawn in a bureaucratic game. They were stripped of their titles, their tenure, and their access to the grand halls they had once called home. Yet, as Thomas walked out of the campus gates for the last time, he felt a lightness that the weight of prestige had always suppressed. The air in the industrial loft was sharp with the scent of ozone and the heavy, metallic tang of the massive high-resolution scanners they had salvaged from the university's liquidation sale. There was no mahogany here, no velvet curtains to dampen the sound of the city outside. The roar of the overhead trains was a constant reminder that they were no longer insulated from the world, but part of its frantic, honest heartbeat. Sloane was hunched over a workbench, her hair tied back with a piece of frayed twine, her hands moving with a fluid, relaxed grace that had been absent in the archives. She wasn't restoring a lie anymore. She was digitizing the Thorne archive, a collection of thousands of letters from forgotten inventors that had begun flooding their mailbox the moment the scandal broke. "People don't just want the truth," she said, looking up as Thomas approached with 2 chipped mugs of coffee. "They want their names back. We're not just researchers, Thomas. We're a lost and found for history." Thomas sat on the edge of the desk, watching Julian in the corner. His brother was meticulously sorting through a stack of blueprints, his movements calm, his mind anchored by the rhythmic, purposeful work. There were no white-coated orderlies here, no chemical fog. Only the sun streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows and the dignity of being useful. "My father was right about one thing," Thomas murmured, watching the light catch the dust motes in the air. "The truth is a cold bed to sleep in. We have no titles, no security, and the board is still trying to sue us into insolvency." He looked at Sloane, at the smudge of ink on her cheek and the fierce, unyielding light in her eyes. "But for the first time in 30 years, I don't wake up feeling like a ghost in my own life. We traded a cathedral for a workshop, and I think we got the better end of the deal." Sloane reached out, her fingers interlacing with his, her grip a warm, solid reality. "The cathedral was a tomb, Thomas. This is a lighthouse." As the sun dipped below the skyline, casting long, honest shadows across the workshop, they turned back to the scanners. There were still thousands of pages to read, thousands of voices waiting to be heard, and for the first time, they had all the time in the world.